thoroughfares in and out of Wilmington is about to undergo some big changes.
City leaders say Dawson and Wooster Streets will look much different by this time next year. WECT's Delaney Tarpley heard from neighbors who live along those streets as they learned more about the proposed improvement plans. What does this all include, Delaney?
Well, John, city leaders have had this project in the works for more than a decade now. It includes plans to add pedestrian crossings, fill in some sidewalk gaps, and reduce the number of lanes on Dawson Street to make way for more parking. Most neighbors I talked to tonight told me they're excited that it's going to happen.
I live right about here.
Living in downtown Wilmington, Edward Sager says he drives on Dawson and Wooster Streets every day.
When you look at Dawson and Wooster, it's kind of the first and last impression that folks get coming into and out of Wilmington.
Which is why he believes those streets need an upgrade. At a community meeting on Wednesday, Sager and other neighbors learned about an extensive improvement project set to start this summer. City staff hopes it will make a big difference.
We just really want to stitch the community back together, stitching sidewalks back together, make it safer for pedestrians and all that.
The project includes plans to cut the number of traffic lanes on Dawson from 4 to 3 to add more on-street parking and bus stop improvements.
During a traffic analysis, they determined that Dawson Street we didn't need the 4th lane, really. So it's just going to add more parking, safer parking, and again, better for pedestrians.
All of these renovations, plus plans to resurface both roads, have brought the cost of the plan up to about $3 million. The funding will come from the State Department of Transportation and Wilmington's transportation bond that passed back in 2014. For Sager, it's well worth the price.
I think it's going to give everybody that comes into our town a much better impression on what they initially see, especially in terms of just the beautification, the greenery, and the roads coming in.
The project manager also told me they think improving the accessibility of the area for pedestrians could also encourage new developments and businesses in that corridor. John.
All right, Delaney, you talked about the project supposed to get underway sometime in the summer, but do they have a specific date for residents to know yet?
Yeah, not quite, but they do think that construction will begin in either July or August. And because there is so much they're trying to accomplish with this project, they think it'll take about a year to complete it. John.
A lot for those folks to look forward to. Delaney, thanks.